Welcome to Product AMA, your daily online Ask Me Anything. We started Product AMA to give those passionate or curious about product management a daily break, something to look forward to.
Our topic for today is building consumer fintech products. And to tell us all about it, we have with us Stephane Overholt, who is the VP of Product at the Open Application Network. Stephane has more than 15 years of experience in the finance industry at various organizations like CIBC, Finastra, and Borrowell, where until recently she was leading the product team. Welcome to Product AMA, Stephane. We are so excited to have you here. Why don't you tell us about yourself and your journey in product management, and also tell us an unknown fact about yourself?
Okay, great. Well, thanks first of all for having me, Rhythm. Nice to see you as always. Appreciate you having me on Product AMA. So as you mentioned, I'm currently VP Product at the Open Application Network. We recently launched Moves, which is a financial platform for independent workers. So we provide gig workers and freelancers access to financial products that meet their unique needs. I think like many folks in product, I have an interesting path into product that I can tell you a little bit about as part of my intro. So I did industrial engineering, wasn't as interested in going into the manufacturing space, so I actually started my career at CIBC, really trying to apply some of those principles in a service environment and how do you really make and improve processes. So got my Lean Six Sigma Black Belt as part of that, and spent 5 years at CIBC, which were great, in more internal consulting type roles. I was really interested in getting into a smaller company where, for me, I really like to be connected to the results of the company and know where my work's contributing. So looking to move to a smaller company and one where I had more ownership. So going from more a consulting role to a bit more ownership. So I had an opportunity to go to a company that was called D&H at the time, and became Finastra. So when I left, it was a 1,000-person Canadian-only company. When I left, it was a 10,000-person global company that was the third largest fintech company in the world. So I started in an operations role there. When I joined, there was no concept of product management at D&H. So D&H at the time was really focused on check printing, but that was not a business that was going to continue to grow. I think that was pretty clear. So a lot of what was happening was looking at ways to acquire different companies and grow through acquisition. So one of the first acquisitions that was made, which is into a more of a tech space, I came in to run the operation for. And really from that role was really my first product role. I just didn't know it at the time because I was working really closely with our engineering teams, defining requirements, doing testing, as well as really working with our clients to understand their needs. So I really enjoyed that role. It was a role that I kind of came back to as I thought about roles that I really enjoyed in my career. I spent almost 10 years at D&H, and I think my introduction to Fintech was as that company was actually looking to really reposition as a fintech company. That's how I got introduced into fintech. So it was kind of along with it. So I spent a lot of time in operations roles, like project management titles. But again, actually a lot of my time there was spent in product. I left shortly after the company had been acquired, and was really looking to go smaller again. So was really excited. Fintech was obviously a much bigger space and much more well-known at the time I was leaving what was then Finastra. And I had an opportunity to join Borrowell, which I was really excited about. I joined Borrowell when there was about 30 people. So already at a stage, had just raised a Series A and have an opportunity to go in there. I actually had a few different roles at Borrowell. So starting in more of a partnership role, owning some of our relationship with CIBC, but really quickly working on our mortgage strategy. So that was really how do we expand that vertical and grow it? So as a product owner in that space, brought a new mortgage origination tool to consumers, and then from there also took on the Borrowell lending business, so a consumer loan product, both from product and operations, and then we restructured into more of a functional model, and then I took over as head of product. So that was kind of my experience at Borrowell, and then recently really excited to have joined the OAN. It's an amazing team with a super strong vision, and I think with Moves and the problems we're trying to solve around the gig economy, really exciting place to be. And I think you also asked me for an interesting fact. So I'll go with, I was once featured on an HGTV show. So there was a home reno done in my house. What I didn't realize doing it at the time there would be so many reruns of it. So I'd often have my colleagues at the time, go to the gym at lunch and come back and say, I was just watching you on TV while I was working out.
Awesome. All right, Stephane. So my first question to you is that You've been in this industry for such a long time, and I'm sure you must have witnessed the technology revolution in financial services. Why don't you tell us about how the landscape of this industry has changed over the years?
Yeah. So, I mean, you have made a few comments now, Rhythm, where you make me sound pretty old, but I guess you're not wrong. So I could give you some examples of how things were a little bit different when I first started. So part of my time at CIBC was in e-channels, it was called at the time, which was ABM and internet. So the fact that those two things were coupled together probably shows you that things were thought about a little bit differently. That area is now the digital strategy team at CIBC. And really, so it was like, that was where, like, the fact that internet was really thought of as a channel as opposed to like a really like strategic offering, I think is somewhat indicative. I think I also mentioned like there was no concept of product management in those earlier days. I mean, I think there were in certain companies, but a lot of companies didn't know really what that was and what the function did. As I mentioned, I didn't know what the concept of Fintech was, and I kind of got there as I was at D&H, and it became more of a Fintech company. And then like some other things that are like, I think everyone would have evolved a lot is like things like when I was at D&H, all of our servers were on premise. Like a huge amount of like what we're thinking about in terms of technology was just dealing with that, where so many of those problems have just been removed with modern technology. And I think like the biggest thing that comes out of that is the speed of change is just hugely increased, just as technology has evolved. Which also means the pace of competition and all those things too.
Of course. Everyone is trying to get there faster and better. Right. So those of you who have joined us recently, we are chatting with Stephane, who is the VP of Product at the Open Application Network. And please feel free to ask any of your questions in the Zoom chat, and I'll take them up very quickly. All right, Stephane, moving on, talking about consumer fintech products. That's the topic for today. How is product management in this domain different from the typical software product management?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's definitely a lot that's the same. I think some things that maybe stand out as differences is, I think adoption's a hurdle. I think from what I've seen, like that's actually particularly a challenge in Canada. Like we're just behind in terms of fintech adoption overall. And some of that is also the competitive landscape with the banks. I think for whatever consumers feel about the banks in Canada, they trust the banks. And it's a very sticky relationship. And trust is so important when it comes to fintech. That's a big thing to overcome. The regulatory environment that you have to work within in fintech is also can be rather challenging. And we're just not there yet. And I mean, as fintech adoption evolves, that will evolve as well. But I think as I kind of mentioned, like so much of it is the same. Like what you need to do in terms of product, in terms of understanding your users, really understanding their problems and how to solve them, and that all of that's is kind of it doesn't really matter what the industry is.
So you talked a lot about regulations and the friction in adoption. So as a product manager, what could we do in terms of like being more successful?
Yeah, I think the first step is to actually understand it and understand the environment you're in. Understand like the legislation that you have to work within so that you can kind of be creative around once you actually know those rules. And there's a lot of others in the space that you can learn from. I mean, I think it's interesting. Like I have some good friends at Finance It. That business started really as like Community Lend, as a peer-to-peer lending business. And I think they really struggled around the regulation and eventually actually pivoted to go much more like point of sale and now focusing in the home improvement space. So I think that was an example of like trying to work within the legislation that was just challenging. So I think it's kind of knowing what you're getting into before you start. So there are challenges, but it is evolving. I mean, there was actually a lot of momentum building for open banking in Canada. Some of that's been pushed off now, given the pandemic, and some of this, consultations that were going to happen have now been pushed to the fall. But like these things are going to come. And I think it's really important for fintech companies to be positioned to reap those benefits. And fintech can be part of the solution by actually showing adoption and being able to show like creative solutions that are really beneficial for consumers. We're actually going to force the legislators to make changes as well. Because I think like, the legislation's there meant to protect from bad actors, but a lot of things that are happening in terms of like innovation were just not contemplated at that time. And it really can really halt innovation where it would be really beneficial to consumers.
Awesome. And uh, like looking at the other side, that is the users of products like robo advisors and other products that are available in this space right now, how can we as PMs make them feel safe, secure, and confident about using such products, especially when there are so many growing concerns like data privacy and algorithm bias?
Yeah, I mean, great question. I think I kind of alluded before that trust is just so incredibly important, and especially if when you are in an environment where Canadians have huge trust for the banks. There's some really tactical things that can be done to address some of that. Like I think using kind of leveraging the trust of other more known providers is helpful, whether that's like affiliate or partner relationships or referrals. I think like for Borrowell in the early days, having that relationship with CIBC and the kind of the extension of trust was really helpful. And it's helpful on the other side for CIBC too, to be working with like an innovative fintech company. But like, I think part of it is like there's being transparent with the users and making things easy to understand is incredibly helpful and powerful. I think, yeah, like being able to talk in language that can be understood and help them understand the benefits, because it does, like, to kind of overcome that trust hurdle, the benefits need to be pretty substantial. And then I think fintech adoption overall, which is something I was talking about, it will also help. So how do we, like as people get more comfortable with those solutions and also are referring their friends, that'll help. The other thing is just like fintechs taking their responsibilities really seriously. And that's something I've definitely seen, because without trust, you don't have a business. So, I mean, there's a lot of ways out there to help make sure that we're protecting data and protecting privacy. And it's just continuing to put that at the foreground of strategy as well, and just understanding what the underlying importance is.
Right. And talking about, Borrowell, we have a question here from Keith, who's
Okay.
asking you about, what kind of regulatory hurdles you faced at Borrowell and how were you able to overcome them?
Yeah, I think Borrowell in a lot of cases is working as a marketplace. So like for at least like for the free credit score and referral side of the business, there'd be like, it's not as heavily regulated. I think that's where like the question before around like data security and privacy is really important. Obviously, like the proper consents are needed to be able to pull credit data, and having that data is something that needs to be protected really strongly. A little differently, like with the Borrowell loan offering, which is where Borrowell started, is with unsecured term loans up to 35,000. There was things like making sure there was compliance to KYC and AML regulations as part of that were really important. And then just some of the relationships forced things like compliance to like SOC audits and a lot of that. So in that way, it was fairly heavily regulated, which I think is not a bad thing. It is really important to protect the consumers and to protect data. And there's a new product, Borrowell Boost, which is also, I think, is pushing some of the boundaries as a product that was not contemplated previously. And I think really it's about understanding and working and innovating ways that are beneficial to the consumer, working within that legislation.
All right. And we have another question here from Anchor. She's saying, being in the banking sector, working in wealth management and real estate secured lending, I've learned that it's hard for any tech company to sell their software, as the industry is very hard to break in, and also not embracing technology usually. What is your process and to strengthen their trust? Also, she's saying, she's making a comment here that banks are primarily heavily regulated, and it is their responsibility to respond to any findings that is related to their data and technology being adopted. So the question is, to reiterate, what is your company doing to help with the adoption process of strengthening the trust of the users?
Yeah, I mean, I think for all companies, like that trust will be earned over time. I think some of the things I talked about, like relationships, are really important in terms of that building trust. I said, like, I think in terms of things like if you actually are trying to get, I think part of the question sounded like, trying to go in and actually work with the banks. Relationships help in some of that as well. it's actually surprising how small the Toronto financial services and fintech community can be. I think for me, like coming out of Finastra, that's created like a really huge network of people that are just throughout financial services and fintech in Toronto, and that can be really helpful in terms of creating those relationships that can help break those barriers for companies that are just getting started. I think there was maybe a second part to that question though that maybe I missed.
Yeah, it was more of a comment that it is the responsibility of the banks to help them to respond to any findings that are related to any of their data and the technology being adopted by them. All right. So great questions, everyone. Please keep them coming, and I'll be picking them up, shortly. Moving on, and changing gears here a little bit. For product managers looking to pivot into this industry, how can they stay on top of the trends as well as expand their knowledge, and what kinds of skills they should focus on?
Okay, great question. I think it's actually been somewhat interesting to me, and I think it's because I've been in financial services, how many candidates are actually intimidated by the idea of getting into financial services or fintech. Like when I've hired PMs, sure, like subject matter helps, but I've typically gone out to try to hire PMs that are just really skilled PMs, and I believe that they can learn really the subject matter. So, I mean, I think for anybody on here who's thinking about getting into fintech, like please don't be intimidated by the subject matter. Like it can be learned, and it actually can be fun to learn. I've definitely had PMs coming in like thinking that would be intimidating and just really enjoyed the things that they learned, trying to understand like a little bit more behind the scenes about financial services. So I'd start there. There's lots of things that can help. So I mean, like this talk is a great example of that. There's a lot of events for like fintech's pretty big in Toronto. There's a lot of events that you can attend to get to see. Like TechTO does a fintech version of their events. There's a few publications that are really great for learning up. Actually, one that I find really useful is Lend It, which is a huge conference in the US, but they actually publish a daily newsletter of all of the things happening in the world around fintech, which is just like a great daily summary. AltFi also has similar content that they publish. And then I think like do the same things you would for any product influencers. So if that's going into LinkedIn and following people, Twitter, all of the other usual means.
And just a personal suggestion as well. There's this app called Finimize to stay on top of all the financial news out there. They provide snippets of financial news, so it might be worth checking out.
Yeah.
We have another question here talking about strategy. So you mentioned about onboarding users and them referring their friends and family further. So what sort of strategy do you adopt or have you adopted in the past for this? The product can be great. Like for example, Borrowell is a great product, but you still need some momentum to get that ball rolling. So what kind of strategy have you adopted in the past?
Yeah, so I mean, I think referral programs is one. Like Borrowell continues to have it. I think for moves, it's really interesting as we've kind of started with a product, really looking to serve people in the gig economy, and like right now focusing on rideshare and food delivery. These are actually really networked communities, which mean like you've got different opportunities in terms of how do you actually look at gaining referrals, but something that we're thinking a lot about in terms of the best way to approach that in the early stages of the product. I mean, I think there's lots of ways to do growth, like some fairly standard methods in terms of how do you get people in. I mean, social media is really powerful in terms of getting friends and family in, as well as like paid referral programs. I think to your point, having a great product that people are willing to refer is really important as well. And then, I mean, like there's a lot of strategies around other companies in Toronto, like promoting each other. I would say like there's a lot of great sites, whether that's like affiliate networks that can help like raise the voices of smaller players and support each other, like whether that's content sharing or placements. I think there's a lot of different paths.
Awesome. Lee's asking a question around other issues in fintech. So apart from the regulatory issues, are there any differences in PM process in the product management process in fintech?
I honestly, I don't really think so, unless I'm just taking it for granted. It's really important in terms of the process that you're still doing your proper product discovery and making sure that you understand your user problems, that what you're building is valuable, that it's feasible, that it's usable. Creating prototypes and testing them, making sure that you know who you're targeting in terms of your audience, that you're testing properly. And then it's like your processes to deliver and build. Potentially, like there's some complexity when it comes to like regulatory environments. I think like that may come into play more, especially if you're looking at expansion initiatives. Like there are across Canada, there's different regulations across provinces when it comes to financial services. The US is very different as well, and it's very much state by state. So I think like there's maybe some overhead that comes into play, but the product processes are the same.
All right. And another question around tools. So what kind of tools have you found effective in product management?
Okay, I'm going to say that this is not a fintech specific question and just related to tools overall.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many out there. I mean, it's interesting now that I'm like being in a company where we're at the really early stages and looking at all the tools that are out there. It's helpful to have some pieces where like I now have the, after seeing so much growth at Borrowell, where we started, where we ended up, and what some of those challenges encountered, it's nice to kind of be able to go back and know what's coming from the beginning. I mean, like you've got all of your, I think like right now we're evaluating a lot of them. I think like there's a lot of benefit in the early days of tools like Google Analytics. I think I've seen where you get to some of the limitations potentially with that as you scale. We're looking at bringing in product analytics like Amplitude. And then I think just looking at how do we want to set up our data infrastructure from the beginning, like knowing where we want to be in the future and strategically. We know that data is a really important part of our strategy. So how do we set that up for the beginning so that we're going to be able to do the analytics that we need to do, that we're going to have the data models set up in a way that's going to be accessible, and that we've got the information in a place that's accessible to the whole team, and kind of doing that from the beginning instead of kind of having to figure it out later and connect the pieces. So it's kind of fun to be on that side of it.
All right. And we have another question here from the audience, that there seems to be a lot of innovation happening within the fintech space, but do you see any particular areas that are being underserved? What opportunities might there be for new players looking to enter the space?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I also last week was on a webinar with the Fintech Growth Syndicate, who like really have a great view of the whole landscape in Toronto. They've made their tool Maple, which actually gives you like, here are all the companies playing in every space freely available during this period, which is really nice. So, and I've obviously been reading up on like, what are the trends happening now and like, where are those opportunities? I think, so, I mean, some things have been really interesting to see play out over this period. Like millennials investing has really, like there's been a lot of adoption there, I think, just as the markets have moved so much. It was interesting, Mogo, who has a way to like buy Bitcoin through their offering, has actually seen a lot of uptake in that, which I think they found like was actually an interesting insight to see. I think like some of the opportunities, there was there was a Deloitte study that was talking about what some of the opportunities could come in terms of underserved markets. And one that came up is just really like financial inclusion overall. So I think this crisis has exposed where there are people who have been underserved, who are challenged, and it's how do we like help them and make sure that they've got options and, I think options and opportunities available, especially coming out of this. And I think I saw an article yesterday specifically around like Canada Post thinking about offering some services. I think that's something like John Oliver actually did a piece on that about could the mail service actually provide banking services in the US? They used to many years ago, and could they do that again? Just to make sure that so financial inclusion and like how do you help people who have like typically been underserved in terms of financial services, I think is one area. And that Deloitte study, one thing that was exciting for us at the OAN with Moves is that empowering gig economy workers, which is a segment that's just growing so quickly right now, is actually another area. I mean, that's where part of our thesis in terms of what we're building as well, is that that's definitely an area where people have been underserved in terms of financial services, and there's a lot of opportunity to come up with creative solutions there.
Awesome. So Stephanie, talking about, trends, I was at a fintech event last week as well, and some leaders were talking about, fintech trends, especially about the ones after the post-COVID era. So for example, I heard someone talking that, credit score will just be a number, and lenders like banks would have to, come up with other criteria of evaluation for giving out loans. What trends do you see emerging, especially during and after the ongoing health crisis?
Yeah, great question. So I think lending, as you mentioned, is something that's been very challenged through this period. I think all of the models that had been built in a lot of ways had to get thrown out the window, and people need to, all lenders have to figure out what does the world look like now? What kind of lending behavior am I going to see? And that there's actually been some really great sources for trying to collect that and have a good pulse in terms of what is happening. But that's something that does need to be rethought, I think, post the crisis. I think other things that are really interesting is just the amount of digital adoption that we've seen. I mean, the Canadian banks, it's just been unreal what they've seen in terms of adoption, whether that's online banking adoption and mobile apps, and things that we haven't seen in Canada, actually being able to do remote mortgage signatures. So I mean, that's definitely been something that's happened through this period that it will continue now that people have actually been kind of forced to adopt some of the things they haven't in the past. I think also contactless payments has been a really interesting thing to see as people are trying to move away from cash. So I think that's also been really accelerated. I think one thing that's going to be really interesting to see coming out of this is, I think, especially for fintech companies that are building solutions that serve businesses that are looking to now get more digital faster. There's probably going to be a lot of opportunities there too, where it might not have been as high on the list for a bank to go out and buy or use a solution from a fintech company. They're going to have a lot more incentive to do that now, and it's going to be a lot higher on their list. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. It's also been a very difficult period for a lot of companies and startups and scale up. So it'll be interesting to see if there's also acquisitions that come out of that, but I think definitely a lot of opportunities for more partnerships. I think there's some of those bigger things. I don't know, Rhythem, did you anything else from your session that stood out for you?
Yeah, I think one thing that I'm really interested in looking at will be the pace of innovation, the pace of digital transformation. And somebody asked about early adopters and early how do you get early users. I think the adoption rate and the user behavior there might change. People will be more welcoming towards e-commerce and financial services by the convenience of their smartphone. And I think that pace will obviously be, that this pandemic will serve as a catalyst to expedite that.
Yeah, for sure. I think things like digital wallets on cell phones and people actually being able to have their cards on their phone, it's just going to be way more common.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we have a question here regarding the early adopters of moves. So are they 18-year-olds or are they 30-year-olds?
I mean, in some ways, probably too soon to say. Probably closer to the latter. But I think, I think we're kind of early to be able to make any major trends. I think one thing that we have learned is that a lot of different people working within the gig economy for a lot of different reasons from a lot of different backgrounds with a lot of different goals. And that's something that we're spending time understanding so that we're making sure that we're solving the right problems and bringing the right solutions.
All right. And the next question is about international expansion. So fintech tends to be restricted by geography because of banking systems and regulations. But are there opportunities to expand it internationally?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been, I think, like mixed success with Canadian companies going internationally. Like there are examples of people who've done it. Like Wealthsimple has gone into other markets. Drop is across a couple of different markets, more on the reward space. I mean, it's definitely something that we're looking to do with Moves in terms of going across the US, and something that we're looking at pretty early. So I think it can be done. This is like where it comes back down to like product fundamentals a little bit. You need to understand your users, you need to understand those differences, and you need to understand where problems can be different, so that you understand where those differences are in terms of geographies. Obviously, like there are going to be some regulatory challenges which may add some hurdles to going to do it, but in practice, it's also just about understanding different needs, and then also understanding the competitive landscape that you'll be operating in and how that can be different.
All right. Awesome questions, everyone. Please keep them coming. We are at the halfway mark right now, and I'll be taking all the questions from you. Keep asking all the questions that you have for Stephanie. So Stephanie, we talked about trends, we talked about regulations, we talked about how fintech has been impacted in the current situation, and now where you sit right now is, you are you're building a product right now, and you're trying to acquire those new users. How is it for you? Like, what has changed for you, and how are you approaching this entire entire launch for your product Moves?
Yeah, good question. I think like it is fun. Like it's fun to be in the early days where like you are learning with basically every customer you come in. I think like the biggest thing, and I think you'd probably attest to this from a product perspective too, is really just trying to understand the users. And I've said this a few times now, but how do we get out there under like all, in the early days, you can actually go and talk to a lot of the people who are coming in to really understand what brought them in, what are their motivations. And so I think like user research is probably the number one thing that's going to be really important in the early days. And then I think like what's also really exciting is having a really good view of where we're trying to go. And like making sure that those kind of early steps are building towards it as well. But it's an exciting time.
Awesome. And Lee's asking another question here, that how do you manage your product team's time allocated to discovery, solutioning / innovation, and delivery?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think like something I've probably spent a lot of time thinking about and trying different ways. For a while at Borrow, we'd actually carved out a separate innovation team to really go and like really focus on discovery for a while as we like look to discover new user problems. There's always pros and cons of both models. So if you go and like have a separate team, like they may have more time to dedicate, but you lose that connection to how are you actually going to go do it. And I think also often you don't get as much of one really valuable stakeholder, which is actually getting engineering involved in the really early stages. So I think like really, engineering is where you're going to find out, where can you really push the technology and bring that in to come up with really creative, innovative solutions. So I think my preference is to be able to do that within the teams. And like that also means that you need to have really great delivery processes, really strong members in the team. And that's something like, I think you're continuing to build, but that's what allows you to free up that time to do the discovery. It ends up, I think, being a little chicken and the egg too. I think once you actually have really solid discovery and good conviction around what you're then going to go build, it's a little easier to then go build it and have more time to do discovery. I've actually found it's a bit of a treadmill to try to get to a place where you've got that confidence around what you're going to do next, so that you're not, while you're delivering, trying to figure out that next thing and trying to build that runway. I think like one of the best solutions to that is having amazing partners in terms of engineering, who can also help drive those priorities and make sure that we're also like attending to things like tech debt and other parts that are really important in terms of as you move forward.
Awesome. And Stephanie, we talked about how the lending situation has changed. Even like from the perspective of the borrowers, situations have situation has become different. And when we are doing some user research around a fintech product, do you see this is part one of the question, do you see
Okay.
any change there, like, as to the feedback or the the insights that you might be getting from users might be a little different now versus pre pandemic era? And how do we as product managers deal with this? How do we get the most accurate information?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where like good product practices of talking to users often and like frequently is really important to understand how things are changing. I think, if you're in a business, you're going to have quantitative data that's going to help support what's happening as well. But things happened really quickly through March. I think that was generally like if you follow anything around fintech, solutions had to be put in place really quickly. People just weren't in a position to be able to make payments. Banks in Canada responded pretty quickly with things like mortgage deferrals. But I think like any lender would have faced pretty quickly a lot of people just not being able to pay and having to come up really quickly with creative solutions. I think where some of those solutions are now in place, what's going to be interesting is then how do you actually help serve consumers coming out of it, and how do you help them like get back into a good place? And I think that's also a really interesting solution space, which I think there was a question earlier about new entrants. That's a place that, how do you help people come back out of this situation into a good place, and also be prepared, for, hopefully, there's no situation like this anytime soon, but, things like individual situations do happen, and how do you have people ready for that?
Awesome. Now this next question is about people trying to pivot into product management or move into product management. So as a product leader, what advice can you give to people that are just trying to move into product management, and advice about how can they get that experience quickly and add value to the teams?
Yeah, great question. So I think a few things there. I think one is I've definitely found, definitely every time I've posted a product management role, there are so many applicants. There's so many people who want to get into product. So I think step one is actually go talk to some product managers and really understand what the role is and read up on it. It is not an easy role, and it's not for everybody. You need such a cross section of skills. You need to be able to work with so many different people. You need to be able to influence without authority. I think, there's pretty common that people think, okay, well, I'm going to be the CEO of the product, and that sounds great. And I've actually interviewed people where they said, yeah, I'm coming out of my MBA. I don't want to be like a founder or CEO yet, but this gives me a taste of it. Well, that's not really the job. So much of it is working with others and influencing, and you're not the CEO. So to understand what the role is, I think it's getting creative around how do you pick up those skills. There's so much you can learn in terms of books and blogs and from others and from events. To start to get that knowledge up. One thing I've encouraged for folks that I've worked with who were trying to come into product from other means is to really try to work with product wherever you can. So, if you're someone who's sitting in a customer success role and you want to get into product, find ways to work with product and to start to show that value. There's a lot of different paths that are all incredibly valuable. So whether that's coming from engineering, whether it's coming from customer success, I think it also helps to get some formal training that you can show as well. Rhythem, I know also know Mo, who runs product faculty in Toronto. Being able to get some of those in-depth courses under your belt is really helpful and shows a commitment to it too. It's such an important role. I have struggled being in smaller companies around how many people can you actually bring on and train into product management, because it does take a big investment to get people there. And versus hiring people with skills. So it is tough to break into, and a lot of people struggle with that. Finding opportunities within a company is a great way to do it, and to find ways to work with product folks. And I have seen a couple of people make that leap that way. So, trying to get that product experience, actually getting some formal training, and then finding, there's also some great associate product manager programs in Toronto too that people can explore.
Absolutely. And I resonate so much with the comment that you earlier made about not being the CEO. I truly believe in that, because, you're just influencing and persuading people. You're just trying to get things done and work together collaboratively. So really, really agree with that. Another question here. is about tech debt. So
Okay.
a challenge that usually comes up as a company moving from a startup stage to a growth stage is the technical debt prevents the scalability. Can you tell us about any experience you've had with restructuring a platform, and should product management be driving that?
I think great question. I think product definitely needs to be part of those decisions. I think I've been really lucky in my career to have amazing partners in engineering that all like are huge partners in driving that. But sure, from like going from having one application that does everything to realizing, okay, you're actually hitting the limitations of scale and having to break that out into microservices. Like I have seen most of that being very engineering driven. But it's also helpful, especially if you're going to make those investments, to have product understanding and helping support that with the business as well as like why that investment needs to be made. Hopefully it's, you know, not because things are on fire and it's like incredibly urgent and you're getting ahead of it before then. But that partnership is so incredibly important for that. And then some of it is like, it is helpful to also know what you're trying to achieve in terms from both a business and product strategy that give you the opportunity to have that foresight. And it's like, it's always a balance between how much do you build for the future versus what do you build now, and like what tools are you going to need, and like what investment do you make when. That is definitely challenging, but that's where having those partners to kind of work through the trade-offs of that is really important.
Awesome. A lot of questions coming in for you, Stephanie. So
Okay.
there is another one that's specific to you and you joining Moves recently. So can you tell us what made you join Moves and why do you want to work on this project for the gig economy?
Was that asked by somebody who I work with at Moves? I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
I know there's a few on this. I mean, I think it's just a really exciting problem space. Like it is a group of people who've been very underserved by financial services. Like we've done user interviews where people said like, I can't go to the loan. Like they don't take my income as income. And some of these people are actually earning great incomes, like if they're driving for Uber or Lyft. And like often the option is either going to be like lending, like borrowing from a friend or going to a payday lender. And that's what we're hoping to help people avoid. And I do love financial services. I do love helping solve financial problems. So for me, that was a really exciting space. And then some of the other big things were just the team that I got to meet through the interview process that I'm really excited to work with. It's a super strong leadership team, as well as I had a chance to meet like the product managers that were there already. And like a lot of people with a great attitude who are also really excited to solve this problem are like two of the big things for me. But I think for product people, it always is, what is that problem you're going to solve? And then as I've kind of mentioned a couple of times, I think the gig economy is just a really great opportunity, as well as more and more people are moving into that space. And like, you know, we talk about it more broadly than the gig economy, but like independent workers overall. And those numbers are just growing and growing quickly, and people are looking for more flexibility in their work. But there's trade-offs of that. So, you know, not actually having an employer, or even if you're like working across platforms, you're not going to have the same degree of benefits or insurance or access to financial products. So there's a lot to be figured out there. That's really exciting.
Yeah, and there's a follow-up question for that, what has been the customer traction so far for Moves as a brand new product and brand new company? And, you, as you mentioned earlier, that Canadians are generally slow to adopt new fintech products. So have there been any trust barriers that you've had to overcome?
Yeah, I mean, I think I saw this at Borrowell. I see that it moves, especially when you're talking about lending money, things like connecting bank accounts. If that's not something you've seen before, that like definitely raises concerns. I mean, I think it was interesting. I think the National Bank had implemented a solution. Like, I mean, these solutions are becoming really common for like bank account verification, whether that's through like Flinks or Plaid. But a lot of customers haven't seen those yet. But those, like, I think the number of consumers in the US who've actually used those platforms is really high now. So like, it just becomes something that's like second nature to be able to do. So it is like, I mean, part of what we do is like a bunch of user testing as well to make sure that the experience is like clean and understood as possible. working with like affiliates where you're kind of leveraging a name that may be more familiar is really helpful. But yeah, people are worried about scams. Like people are really well educated around their data and what some of the risks are. And that's something you need to overcome. So it also means you have to really have a really compelling offering. And it's something we're working through. But we're really excited about early traction. I think like there's a huge opportunity there. As I mentioned, like referrals are a great opportunity, and like we've loved seeing like some of the early adopters referring eagerly into their circles, which is exciting to see.
Awesome. So how about you share an experience with us where there was a product launch that failed, and what did you learn from it?
Well, that's interesting. Maybe I won't go into a specific name of a product and company. I would say like there was a launch that I was involved in that didn't perform as expected. And I think for me, it was a really big learning in product marketing. I think it's really easy to get caught up in the building and even like, you know, how like the usability and all of those fun problems to solve. And when you're running so fast as you often are in a startup or a scale up environment, sometimes you miss thinking about, okay, and now we actually need to figure out how do we like get people into this and using it. And sometimes when you're introducing something new, there could be trade-offs with things that are existing that are hard to make, and there's actually like buy-in required there. So I'd say that I have had like an experience of kind of taking the product marketing for granted and realizing that without that and really understanding the positioning and as well as like how do you actually just bring awareness, doesn't matter how great your product is.
Awesome. Another question about fintech in general. So do you think labeling companies as fintech restricts innovation?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think like a simple answer would be no, mostly because like it's not like there's like like you have to register to be licensed as a fintech. Like in a lot of ways, it's really a label. I think that's the easy answer there.
Awesome. All right, let me just browse through if we have any more questions. All right, here's another one. It's about hiring again. So what's more important in hiring product managers in fintech? Domain expertise or product management experience? Is one more teachable than the other?
I mean, my take is that it's actually a lot easier to learn the subject matter than it is to learn to be a great PM. So I would like personally, I mean, sure, you can get both, great. But I think it's much more important. I think like the skills that PMs need just really cross industries. And actually what's more important for PMs are they excited about the domain they're in? So it's not necessarily do they have that expertise, but do they want to be in it? Are they excited about the problems they're going to solve? Because a great PM who's not excited about what they're trying to do is not going to be as powerful as a PM who's really excited and really invested in that problem set. But I would lean heavily towards great PM over huge amounts of subject matter expertise.
Awesome. So I think that's all the questions we have. We got another one. Here's another one. What is your perspective on crowd investing and crowd lending? Do you think this represents a significant opportunity?
I mean, I think it's interesting. I think I kind of referred to like the early days of Finance It earlier, starting as community lend. There was some big challenges from a perspective of there in terms of legislation that was limiting. So I do think it is an interesting opportunity. I think it's one worth exploring. I think there's some really interesting things happening in other markets. I think the question is, can that work here? And I think that's like still to be determined. But a lot of the big online lenders in the US, that is their model, or at least like a big portion of it. It's interesting, like companies like Upstart started with more peer-to-peer lending and have actually evolved to securitize a lot more of their lending over time, just to like support that scale. So I do think theoretically it's a great opportunity in Canada. I think whether it can be executed upon, we'll see.
So I think that's all for today, and that's all
Great.
the questions we had. So many questions coming in and so many insights coming out of them. So thank you so much, Stephanie. It was a pleasure to have you on Product AMA, and thank you so much for sharing all the different experiences and examples from your journey in product management.
Thanks, Rhythm.
Follow Product AMA on Twitter and send us your topic suggestions. We look forward to seeing you soon.